Hi, welcome to week 5. Um, this week we're reading a French philosopher by the name of Jacques Ellul, and he has a rather unique take on the concept of propaganda. He sees propaganda as a technique or part of the technological society. So, in order to explain what he means by that, I thought I'd make this little video to give you some background on Ellul and his basic ideas. And we need to put him into context. He is writing in the mid 20th century, about the 1950s or so. Last week, we read about the rise of state propaganda and how it was connected to new mass communications technologies such as radio. And we talked about how it was during the First World War that nation states first started to use these new technologies to mobilize the masses, right? We read about Edward Bernays and W.E.B. Du Bois, both of whom saw the promise of propaganda in being able to facilitate democracy, even make the world more democratic. And then on the other hand, we read Walter Lippmann, who was much less sanguine about the possibility of propaganda being beneficial for democracy. He saw propaganda as a threat to democracy. Well, this week we're reading Ellul, who definitely falls alongside Lippmann in his pessimism. Now, I want you to understand also why he's pessimistic, not just that he is. Ellul focuses on the fact that propaganda has a political goal, which is, of course, to mobilize the masses, right? So that idea is key to understanding why Ellul describes propaganda as a technique. So we think about the connection between technology and propaganda still this week. I'd also like to point out that Ellul is really our first political theorist that we've read on this subject. Walter Lippmann was a columnist and a journalist. Edward Bernays went on to found the public relations field, so we could say he worked in communications. Du Bois was a sociologist. Ellul is a philosopher. And as we know from earlier in this class, that political philosophy is pretty much the same thing as political theory. He's really the first person that we're reading to in this class to approach this question of democracy and propaganda from a political theory perspective. So remember what that means, what political theory is, and how it differs from empirical studies. Remember I said that empirical studies pretty much show like what is happening in the world, or they determine, sort of simple sorts of things like correlations between voting and education, for example. They're sort of describing aspects of the world that we live in, how it works, right? So political theory is much more idealistic. It's much more focused on how the political world should look if we want to maximize human well-being and happiness. Okay, so it's focused on those kinds of idealistic questions. What is the goal that we should be working towards if we want to create a better society for human beings to live in, right? So this is the approach that Ellul is taking when he's thinking about the concept, not just of propaganda, but he's thinking about what he calls the technological society, his description of what the modern world is as a whole. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. But first, what I'm going to do in this video is just give you a brief overview of who the man was. And then I'll get into his concept of the technological society and why he sees propaganda as a technique. Okay, so first, just to start off with some basic facts, he is a 20th century guy. These are his dates. You can see that he was born in 1912, so that means he was a young man during the Nazi occupation of his country. And he actually was a member of the French resistance. He helped get Jews out of dangerous areas and into either safer areas of France or out of the country altogether. Later, he was awarded, later after his death, he was awarded an award for this by the State of Israel. But he mostly identified as an academic rather than an activist. And most of his career he taught at the University of Bordeaux in France. He was trained as a sociologist. His title was he was a sociologist of institutions, but he also loved theology. So his all of his body of works, which is quite extensive, he wrote about like 50 books. All of his works can be divided into those two categories. There are his sociological works and his theological works. And you'll notice if you read them is that he's very pessimistic in his sociological works. And he saves all his optimism for his theological works. And that's for a very important reason that goes to the very first bullet point I have here. Jacques Ellul described himself as a Christian anarchist. I put the word libertarian. He didn't use that word. It's more precise to say Christian anarchist. What that means is that he basically did not see any hope for humanity to fulfill its full potential in any kind of political system. He saw the answer only through the answer to that, to helping humans fulfill their full potential, only through a spiritual means, through his spiritual tradition of Christianity, for example. So Christian anarchists is not a super common term. I've actually only come across a couple of other people who described themselves in similar ways. And that was Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, and they were also of the early 20th century. And they used the term Catholic anarchist because they were both Catholics. Dorothy Day, you may have heard her name. She might be a little bit more famous than her colleague Peter Morin. But Dorothy Day was first an activist. It was during the Great Depression, and she was very involved in, helping the poor, feeding the poor. And then she became converted to Catholicism. And Peter Morin was a Catholic priest. So both of them founded the Catholic worker movement in the United States. And if you've never heard of the Catholic worker movement, it's just basically a very activisty type of approach to Catholicism, where they wanted to not start homeless shelters exactly, but they are houses that are where people live in communities with one another, and the doors are open essentially to anyone who needs a place to stay. But the so-called workers live together with the people being helped. The people helping live together with the people being helped. So that's what they were known for. These were very popular during the 30s and into the 40s and 50s. I think there's not so many of them around today, but there are still a few. And I've visited some of them. There's a very active one in Chicago, for example. But those are the only two other people that I know of who described themselves in these terms of Christian or Catholic anarchists. And the reason is just because that they don't look to the political world for answers, pretty much. So it's important to remember that Jacques Ellul defined himself in those terms, which is why his sociological works seem very pessimistic. That's because, like I said, he saved all his optimism for his theological works for this reason. So there is an International Jacques Ellul Society. So he's not super well known, but he's got a solid reputation, and he's known today in both of those fields, in sociology for his critique of the technological society, and also in Christian circles for his theological works about Christianity. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to Jacques Ellul as the man, for example. In the next slide, I'll tell you about his concept of the technological society. Okay, so remember again last week we were talking about the history of state propaganda and how it was connected to the invention of new technologies, such as the radio, right? Well, this week we're expanding upon that idea that propaganda and technology are interconnected. But Ellul argues that propaganda doesn't just come from technology. It itself is a technology, or more precisely, he says his term is, it is a technique. So what does he mean by that? For Ellul defines technique as the one best way of doing something in order to achieve some goal, right? So remember how we said in the first slide that propaganda, Ellul really focuses on the fact that it is goal-oriented. It has as its goal the goal is to mobilize the masses in order to achieve some political action, right? So that is the definition of technique according to Ellul. What is the one best way to do something in order to achieve some other purpose, right? So his book, The Technological Society, was written in 1954, translated into English approximately 10 years later. It was popularized by the author of Brave New World, the novel. Many of you may have read it in high school or earlier in your college careers. It was popularized by Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World. But in this book, The Technological Society, written in 1954, Ellul talks about what he means by technique as being the one best way to do something. Think of it this way. What is the one best way to turn water into energy, right? Or how can we spin cotton into thread to make fabric, and then, cut and sew fabrics to make clothes, for example. In other words, this is a utilitarian approach to knowledge. It's knowledge for practical purposes. It might be what we call applied sciences today. Ellul doesn't use that term, and he has a nitpick with it, so it's not technically correct, but it's good enough to think of it in that way. Because Ellul says almost all sciences today are applied sciences. They're science for some purpose, even if they're only theoretical. So it's a little confusing, but there's two things to remember about technique. One, it doesn't have to be referring only to advanced technological societies like the one that we live in today. There are primitive techniques. Primitive societies had techniques of hunting, for example, which is the one best way to catch a stag so that we can eat tonight, for example. It's a utilitarian approach to knowledge. And that leads to the second point, which is two, techniques are not in and of themselves inherently bad. Ellul is not a Luddite. He's not wanting society to do away with all technique just for the sake of technique. What he's talking about in his concept of the technological society is he's criticizing the way the modern world has organized everything, all knowledge, around a utilitarian purpose. How technique comes to dominate all aspects of modern life. It becomes an end in itself. So Ellul, I've got to mention also, was very influenced by Karl Marx, but he disagreed with Marx on the idea that he said it's not capitalism that defines the modern world. It is actually technique. So remember, Jacques Ellul was writing during the height of the Cold War in the 1950s, and he would say that between the United States and the USSR, there is no difference. They are both defined by technique. They are both participants in the technological society that we live in today. So Ellul would say it's not capitalism that defines the modern world. It is indeed technique, right? So that brings us to our last point I'll make in this brief little video, which is the difference between ancient and modern political theories. So if you remember, we talked about how the ancients, and we're going to talk about this more in a couple of weeks when we read Plato, for the ancients, knowledge is a goal in and of itself. In order to understand, humanity, what is the nature of humanity? What is our role in this world? What is the nature of God, for example? Humans in the ancient world wanted to understand for the sake of understanding. It wasn't until the modern period, which remember in political theory, the modern period begins in the early 1500s, Machiavelli, John Locke came later, and his philosophy really marks that shift. Locke was very much focused on, he says we can't know those questions about things like the nature of God. We can only know this world here and now around us. And the best way for us to know this world is through empiricism, which is just the idea that knowledge comes from our senses, that we can see and taste and hear and smell things in the world around us, and we can devise a system, the scientific method, in order to gain knowledge and understanding about this world. So this becomes a very popular way of understanding the world in the modern period, and it's enormously successful in the natural sciences, right? Think this is the time of Copernicus and Galileo, and they're discovering gravity and how the planets work and how the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. All of these great developments in the natural sciences were happening during this modern period, the early modern period of political thinking, and so John Locke was a great proponent of this as being the best approach to understanding, right? So it's a very utilitarian, it's a much more utilitarian approach than what the ancients had. And that becomes one of the key differences between the ancient political thinkers and the modern ones, okay? So in the next slide, what I'm going to do is explain why Ellul says that propaganda is a technique, okay? Okay, the key to understanding why Ellul sees propaganda as a technique is to remember what he's describing about the modern world. He says the technological society is so artificial that humans need techniques in order to help us adapt to it. Like, we're not meant to, be sitting at desks for 8 hours a day, right? Even with all, labor reforms, such as limiting the workday to 8 hours. And even if we're not working on an assembly line, we're doing brain work, even with all these various kinds of reforms to make modern industrial life a little bit more less soul crushing, to say. Even with all of that, it's still the life that modern humans lead in the technological society, according to Ellul, is so artificial that humans can't survive it. We need something to help us adapt. So we need various, what he calls human techniques. And propaganda is one of the human techniques. There are multiple human techniques. There's the human techniques of amusement. So we use movies. He talks a lot about movies in his book, about how that is used to help us find meaning in life, since meaning in our lives is now so lost. We're just, existing within this giant mass machine, producing profit. We've lost all sense of meaning. So in order to keep us from getting too depressed about our meaningless lives, we have movies to help distract us and help us pretend that we can, be somewhere else and be living a life full of meaning and purpose somewhere else. That's an example of a human technique. So propaganda is another one of these human techniques that helps us adapt to living in the technological world, right? Propaganda, again, it's communication intended to reach the masses. So it's tailored. It's supposed to sound personal to us, but it's also mass produced, reaching all of the masses. If it doesn't sound personal to us, it won't have any effect, right? So there's all these psychological techniques that propaganda uses. So propaganda is mass communication to large numbers of people. It uses emotions. It uses those psychological techniques to appeal to the masses, and it has some goal or purpose. And that purpose isn't always as explicit as, mobilizing people to fight a war. Propaganda, in Ellul's view, in this sense of the word, propaganda helps us integrate into society, or it can help agitate. There's different kinds of propaganda we'll see in the article that we're reading this week, and one of the most key ones is that difference between propaganda that integrates and propaganda that agitates, because there's both. The integration propaganda integrates us into the existing social order. Agitation propaganda is the kind of propaganda that agitates people into having a revolution, for example, such as during the Russian Revolution during 1917. That had used agitation propaganda. So all propaganda falls into either those two types. It either integrates us or it stirs us up to overthrow the current social order. And then he also talks about vertical propaganda versus horizontal. Vertical, of course, coming from the top down, so coming from authority figures down to individuals. Horizontal propaganda, though, however, comes from our peers. So both of these different kinds. There's some other kinds, too, that he'll talk about in the article. But that's the main... That's it in a nutshell. This is what Ellul is talking about when he talks about propaganda as a technique. In order to understand that, you need to understand his concept of the technological society as a whole. So I've tried to give you a brief overview of that idea in this video. You'll understand it a bit more when you go into the readings for this week, which is not too long. Like I said, we didn't have time to read Ellul directly. So what we're doing this week is we're reading an article about Ellul. And it's only about 20 pages. So I think you'll find the ideas very thought-provoking, very intriguing, and it will sink in well. We'll want to remember some of these ideas as we read some of the other political theorists, like Hannah Arendt. We're going to read Plato in a couple of weeks, and then we'll even get into some postmodern views about democracy and propaganda. Okay, so I hope this little video helped kind of introduce the man and his concept of the technological society and why he sees propaganda as a technique. I'll see you all in class on Monday. Bye-bye.